what we've been learning in this module to the South African context. I've tried to make this as up-to-date and relevant as possible. And so this particular article here, which I'll give you the link to, talks about how COVID-19 is boosting monopolization market power. So this particular article here pertains to the US, and it's saying just because of some of the regulations, how certain companies have increased their market power, their ability, as you know, to mark price up above marginal cost, etc., and monopolization. And it's also because with the regulations, fewer firms have been able to operate, and also bigger companies have had the financial capital to withstand shocks and not trading during specific times or cut in their consumer base. I'm going to have another look at an article pertaining to South Africa during the time of COVID later on in this session. We find that market concentration in South Africa has been quite extensive, and we look at some of the historical factors for that. The South African economy was rooted in mining originally, okay? We had a comparative advantage in that. And this led to the formation of these large conglomerates like Anglo-American, etc. There was heavy government involvement in the economy, such as in parastatals, government-run monopolies, etc. Lots of assistance to certain industry, perhaps mining industry, etc. And it thought that whilst a previous government was busy looking at concentrating on political issues, there were a handful of entrepreneurs who were able to merge, etc., in an unfettered manner and achieve more concentration than would be possible nowadays. Added to this was racial discrimination in terms of access to land, enterprise, labor, etc. Many inward-looking policies, so market isolation due to sanctions, etc. So you were not allowed to invest abroad. So it led to local industries just continually looking to other local opportunities and acquiring other firms, merging with other firms, etc., and increasing market concentration to a large extent. A small market size then. So your concentration levels for South African industries are particularly high, and some of these have fallen over time with competition policy in place. They're still very high, and with a large number of sectors dominated by a few big firms. So the Competition Act came into place in 1998, and I'd like you to take a look at the following websites for the Competition Commission, the Tribunal, which hears particular cases that come before the Competition Commission, and the Competition Appeal Court. And I want you to just have a feel for what our competition policy is about. So according to Chapter 2 of this Act, some of the following would be prohibited practices. So restricting certain horizontal practices, anything that might prevent or lessen competition. Okay, so the aim of our competition policy is to increase competition in industries. So if you're looking at firms selling a similar product, they mustn't be able to prevent or lessen competition. So they wouldn't be able to price fix or divide markets. Sounds familiar when we think about cartels. So things like that would be prohibited. Restricting certain vertical practices. So if you think about, like, for example, we've got a shoe manufacturer that wanted to buy up all the suppliers of leather. They could then control what the competition gets the price of leather at. And anything like that is aimed at preventing or lessening competition would be prohibited. Also, if they try to impose a minimum resale price, for instance, as well. The abuse of a dominant position would also be something that the Commission would look at. Excessive pricing. When you require or induce a supplier or customer to not deal with a particular competitor, for instance. or if you refuse to give your competitor access to essential facility that you've got control over. These are the types of things that are abusing a dominant position in the industry. And you can look at the figures there for when we consider a firm to be dominant in the market. For example, if it's got at least 45% of the market, etc. Take a look at that. Okay, so we'd also be concerned about firms merging. And so historically, this could happen in quite an unfettered manner, unchecked. But nowadays, they would look and see, well, is this merger going to prevent or lessen competition in the industry? Or are there going to be major technological gains that can be had from this? So you think natural monopoly here, okay? For instance, we saw that one firm could, if it had a falling long run average cost curve over a large section of output, it was possible that it could achieve economies of scale, bulk buying, etc., specialization of labor, etc. And if it indeed were to pass those cost savings on to consumers, there might be an argument why, for instance, one firm would be better than a couple. However, you have to be very careful that they will not abuse their dominant position, because typically without competition, this is often the case. And also when they're run by government, do they always achieve such efficiency? These are questions. Would this merger be in the public interests? So what we do is we can try to calculate and get an idea of how concentrated your industry is already, and consider whether if two, say, dominant players in that industry wanted to merge, you could see that would significantly affect competition in that industry, etc. So that they may not consider that. Here's another example of a merger and related to textbooks. So one that you could relate to. You can have a look at that link. So if you have a look at competition policy and just read through the following, it's what is South African competition policy aiming to do? It's trying to create a free and competitive environment where you've got more allocative efficiency, where you bring your price closer to the social marginal cost of producing that good, as opposed to having very high prices charged that are way above your marginal cost. Okay, where firms have, we call that market power, too much market power. So you're also trying to achieve our macroeconomic goals for South Africa, things that are in the public interest. So the purpose of the Act is to promote and maintain competition. So to promote efficiency, etc. You can look through these, and you don't have to learn these off by heart, but definitely get a feel for what it's trying to encourage. To provide consumers with competitive prices and product choices, to promote employment, advance the social and economic welfare of all South Africans, to expand opportunities for South African for their participation in world markets as well, and recognize the role of foreign competition in the Republic. We see, and if you study a course in trade, you can see that international trade brings more gains than losses. Yes, there are certain sectors that would lose, but it certainly pays economies to specialize in that which they have a comparative advantage in, that which they're good at. Also to benefit the consumer, because there are other things that other countries are better at that you could get much cheaper. To ensure that small and medium-sized enterprises have an equitable opportunity, and I think this is a huge area, important area, to encourage small, medium-sized enterprises, to give them access to markets, to remove barriers to entry in those markets. To promote a greater spread of ownership, in particular to increase the ownership stakes of historically disadvantaged people. So in South Africa, we found historically that there was a concentration of control, shareholder control, not necessarily ownership. Actually, there was far greater concentration of control than there was ownership. So we've seen much progress made in terms of South African competition policy, still some way to go. Okay, so we can use a structure, conduct, performance approach to see what is the structure of a particular industry, what's the market power concentration like in that industry? Is it more monopolistic? Is it perfectly competitive? What is it like? Conduct, to see how do your firms and consumers behave in that market. To have a look at, what's their pricing like, etc., and then performance to evaluate what is this like from a welfare point of view, what is it like in terms of productive and allocative efficiency, how does that market operate. An analytical approach, we've got to make sure that we have the correct definition of a market. If you want to actually identify the extent of concentration, how do you define the market? Because this can make a big difference as to whether you think the market's concentrated or not. So, for example, if you said we're looking at the shoe market in Gauteng versus the whole of South Africa, and if you're looking at a particular player, you might say, well, they're not a monopoly, not in South Africa. But if you were to narrow your focus geographically and looking at Gauteng, you might say, well, they are definitely a monopoly. They're the monopoly for Gauteng. So how you define your market and how you define your product market too can make a big difference as to how concentrated you view the industry as being. All right, so an important measure of concentration is looking at market power. And we've already looked at a measure of that, your learner index, the ability to mark up the price above marginal cost as a proportion of price. And we saw how that was related to your price elasticity of demand. So we can also look at the price to marginal cost ratio. We know that it's another measure where we know for perfect competition we should get a ratio of 1. So the price we know is equal to marginal revenue is equal to marginal cost and equilibrium. So price is equal to marginal cost. So your price to marginal cost ratio should be 1. So price 10, marginal cost 10, 10 over 10, you get a value of 1. The greater the prices above marginal cost, the greater your market power, as you would expect, for example, with a monopoly. So concentration indices measure the scarcity of firms and inequality in the size of those firms that you may have in that industry. So we're going to look at a couple of different ways of trying to estimate such concentration. And this is first way is a CR4. Okay, this shows how much of the industry is dominated by your biggest 4 firms. All right, so you can get a multiple choice question on this, quite simple to work out when you know how. So you simply take the sales of the top 4 firms here. Okay, so it would be this. Firm 1's got 150 million. That's the biggest firm. Then firm 2, 100 million. Firm 3, 80 million. And firm 4, 70 million. Okay, and then the rest of, there are actually 25 firms in this particular industry. But we are interested in the sales of the top 4 firms. So we add those together. We add 150 plus 100 plus 80 plus 70, and we get 400 million. Okay? And we work that out as a proportion of your total sales for that industry. And you'll find that you get a percentage, 88.9%. So what does this suggest? It suggests that basically 89% of the industry is dominated by your biggest 4 firms. Okay, so it's very concentrated. And we can see that, therefore, that you can't just go on the basis of the number of firms, because there's actually quite a number of firms in this industry. There are 25. But how concentrated is it? It's very concentrated. The top 4 firms account for basically 89% of the sales in that market. One of the problems with this measure, 4 firm concentration ratio, the CR4, is that 2 industries with the same CR4 can behave very differently due to all those firms that you don't take into account. So it's not, all of these measures have got potential problems with them. So it's also best to use perhaps a few different measures. And it's interesting to learn about these things, because you may pick up a newspaper article one day and looking at the finance section, the business section of the newspaper, and it's talking about concentration and something like this. your CR4, or it could be talking about the HHI index. Okay, so this is another measure of concentration. This is the Herfindahl-Hirschman index, or HHI. And what it is simply the sum of the squared market shares for all the firms in the market. Okay, so if you get a multiple choice question on this, show you what you do. You basically take the individual shares of the various firms and you square them first individually and add them up. Okay, so you see here you're going to get 40 squared plus 30 squared plus take the next market share plus 20 squared plus 9 squared plus 1 squared. Okay, and you obviously you square them first and then add them. So 40 squared and work that out, write it down, and then add it to 30 squared, etc. Okay, and you find that you get a value there of 2982. Okay, so this is the value that you get. Now we want to compare that to a value if two of these firms in this industry merge. So this is something that your competition commission would consider. So a couple of the firms in this industry plan to merge and they put this proposal forward. So the two firms that are going to merge are 3 and 4. Okay. So what we do is to first add up their market shares and then square that. Okay, so as opposed to going 20 squared plus 9 squared separately, like we did over here, the difference is, sorry, let's go down a slide. What we're going to do now is firm 1 remains the same. Let's just get the pen. Okay, so firm 1 remains the same at 40 squared. Firm 2, nothing's changing there, remains the same at 30 squared. But now instead of going plus 20 squared individually plus 9 squared, you add them first. So you get 29 and square it like that. And then you add your last firm, which remains the same. So that's the key difference. Instead of squaring these separately and then adding them together, you first add their shares together and then square it. And you see that you're getting a value over 3,000. You're getting 3,342. So you can see that it has increased your HHI index to quite an extent. And over the page, we can see when we should be concerned about particular values of an HHI or not. So an HHI index is going to vary from near 0 for perfect competition because individual firms have got like a negligible share of the market, like 0. Whatever. There's so many of them, okay? So when you square 0, you basically get 0. Add them all up, you get 0. So for perfect competition, you expect a value near 0, okay? For a monopoly is one firm, so it's got 100% market share, and if you square that, you get 10,000. All right, so that's what your HHI value is going to vary from 0 through to 10,000. According to the American merger guidelines, anything from 0 to 1,000 represents an unconcentrated market. If you get an HHI of 1,000, between 1,000 and 1,800, moderately concentrated, and anything above 1,800 would be seen as concentrated. So that example we did is already a concentrated industry, and it would be unlikely, therefore, that that merger would be allowed. So you can take a look at some past multiple choice questions to this effect. See how to answer them. So barriers to entry. And I think this is a hugely important aspect of competition policy, is trying to remove barriers to entry, and particularly for small and medium enterprises also to come into certain industries. So the threat of entry always disciplines firms. If you're a monopoly and there are massive barriers to entry and you're protected by government regulation, are you going to really achieve a competitive efficiency, for example, without that? Developing countries, we see there is need a certain amount of government regulation, etc. and competition policy should focus on removing such barriers to the industry. I just wanted to try to, as I said earlier, to apply some of this to our current situation with the COVID-19 crisis. And this particular article looks at excessive pricing and so on in Africa. And it also, there's another article that looks particularly, this one looks at Africa and South Africa in particular. And this article here looks at some of the cases that have been pursued by the South African Competition Commission. So we see that there's been excessive pricing when it comes to hand sanitizers, the provision of masks, and the like during this time. And so these are some of the cases that have been presented to the Competition Commission for inquiry. So people abusing positions, particularly positions of dominance during a crisis and charging excessive prices, but it hasn't gone unnoticed. And it talks about the fact that they've had to have hearings, even they've been virtual hearings, but they've still been trying to deal with this. I particularly think, as I've been watching the progression of this pandemic, etc., it struck me right from the start as, gee, this is actually quite interesting for this particular section that we study in terms of competition policy, because certain regulations during lockdown, particularly hard lockdown, they only allowed those companies that already sold food, for example, to sell clothing. And I was thinking, gee, this will have interesting ramifications for the concentration of market power, etc. Other regulations, like as to what kind of shoes you can buy and what type of products, etc. Very interesting from a competition policy point of view. Of course, certain regulations are required dealing with very extraordinary circumstances, and so governments the world over trying to do the best they can under in a difficult situation that's suddenly been thrust upon them. But there are ramifications, certainly, in terms of increasing, particularly monopoly powers and market concentration. It also, as I alluded to earlier, bigger players will obviously be able to survive such a storm more easily. These difficult periods of time, they have far greater access to financial capital. And this is the worrying thing, is what happens to your very small, medium-sized enterprises. Government have tried to provide some relief to those companies, but certainly those are the ones that will feel the pinch. This is, as I say, you can go through this article too. The links will be made available in terms of looking at excessive prices, monopolization during these times. I hope that you will find this section interesting. I hope that you will see how you can apply what you've learned to what's going on around you. And often I tease students because they always say, we want our syllabus to be more relevant and local, etc., and applied to our context. And often when we've put questions on South Africa in a test and that, the students were like, but we didn't learn that. And I say to them, why didn't you learn it? And they were like, oh, because it was on South Africa, so we figured it wasn't important. And I said to them, well, that's kind of ironic, because you keep asking to apply this to our context. And so please don't assume that just because it pertains to South Africa, it's not important or relevant.